So we talked about generalization. So related stimuli to that conditioned stimulus can elicit the conditioned response. In the case of little Albert, you have the rat. Then it became a fear of a dog, a white dog. Then it was a mask. So it started to grow. Whereas stimulus discrimination is that only the specific stimuli can elicit the conditioned response. And this is going to vary based on the person in which it occurs, the learning occurs. So for example, if a small child gets bit by a large black dog, an example of stimulus discrimination is that only the black dogs will elicit the fear in the child. If the child sees maybe a white dog, they might not be scared of it. That's stimulus discrimination. But if the child develops a sense of stimulus generalization, all dogs may elicit this fear response, despite the fact that it was just a large black dog that bit her or him. So you see the difference there. Now, with Pavlov experience, going back to Ivan Pavlov, the physiologist, he wanted to study originally the salivation patterns of dogs. And he discovered, so what he would do is these words are kind of confusing, I might change them up on your PowerPoint. But what he would do is he would just present the dog with food, and he would see that the dog would salivate. So our unconditioned stimulus is the food, the unconditioned response is the salivation. Well, before he brought in the food, he would ring a bell. And he noticed that after so much time, eventually the dog started drooling just when they heard the bell. So again, we see those repeated pairings. Bell rings, here's the food, they salivate. So it's all very closely timed, so the dogs learn to associate that bell ringing with the presentation of food. So the conditioned stimulus is now the bell, and it's been associated with that unconditioned stimulus of the meat or the food, which leads to the unconditioned response of salivating. Well, eventually, that conditioned stimulus itself will lead to the conditioned response. Doesn't necessarily need to accompany the food because it's already been paired so many times. An example of this in your life, have you ever gotten sick when you were younger and your mother gave you ginger ale or Sprite because they believed that this would help the nausea? How many of you will happily drink that beverage today? If you said you do not, it's probably because you associate it with those feelings of nausea, or maybe you associate it with just being sick in general. The same thing happens in cases of food poisoning and fear, classical conditioning of fear. So, a little bit of an out there example. If someone were afraid of bees, let's say a person got stung by a bee, the unconditioned stimulus is the bee sting, the unconditioned response is the pain, right? Well, maybe they were standing by a garbage can when they got stung by the bee. Well, I've learned to associate that garbage with having bees in it. So the garbage may elicit this pain or fear response that they originally attributed to the bee. We're going to have some more examples. But first, I want you to think of what examples of classical conditioning can you think of from your own life? I know that some people, another type of classical conditioning is when you watch a scary movie. So usually something pops up in a scary movie and it elicits a fear response, right? Well, we also know that the music in the background can give us a clue as to what's happening because we've associated those events with the music being played. So sometimes people close their ears when they watch a scary movie, or they don't want to listen to the music because the music scares them. That's another type of classical conditioning. Or maybe you have smelled a perfume or a cologne that reminded you of someone you'd rather forget, right? Maybe an ex or something. Well, those types of smells and senses we've learned to associate with that person and the feelings we have towards that person, that's another example of classical conditioning. Now, we have an activity which this would work better in class, but just try to imagine you're in class. Let's take out a blank sheet of paper. Take out a pen. Put everything you have on the floor. Put your cell phone away and get your pens ready. Relax. What did you think was going to happen? If you were sitting in the classroom, what did you think might have been occurring? Maybe a pop quiz of sorts? Well, that's a conditioned emotional response. So we've conditioned your emotional response to that specific instance or event in your life. So originally, the conditioned stimulus is going to be the instructions. So originally nothing happens if you're just reading the instructions. But usually if we think that it's going to be a quiz, that unconditioned stimulus of a quiz can lead to an unconditioned response of anxiety. Quiz may be testing anxiety. But those instructions have been a precursor to a lot of quizzes. So repeatedly, those instructions are going to yield the same sort of testing anxiety. Does that make sense? That's how we condition emotional responses. Again, eventually that conditioned stimulus will yield the same result as the quiz itself. So just the instructions may make you think that a quiz is going to be there, and you may have those same feelings. So a quick discussion question. Which do you think takes longer? Now that we've established all of these associations through classical conditioning, do you think the initial conditioning or trying to extinguish or stop the association from happening? Why? When we extinguish a behavior, we're trying to get rid of the associations we've formed with specific instances, trying to get rid of those specific emotional reactions we've had. Why? So, I'm inclined to say that it is more difficult to extinguish the behavior. It takes longer because once we've ingrained these habits, they're going to be quite pervasive. And sometimes these associations, even if we've extinguished them, can reappear randomly. So for example, let's just talk about extinction. Extinction is trying to kind of sever the association. So we're trying not to get this dog to associate the bell with food anymore, right? In Pavlov's study. So after all that conditioning we did, remember, that bell is the conditioned stimulus and it's going to elicit the conditioned response of salivating. After many trials, the way that we try to break this association of the bell with the food is just ringing the bell and not giving the dog the food. We're removing the unconditioned stimulus. We're presenting the conditioned stimulus to see if we could just kind of have the dog forget about that association. Eventually, if you keep ringing that bell and you're not bringing food, the dog's going to forget what that bell kind of stood for. So that dog is not going to have a reaction to the bell anymore if you're not giving the food. And now another method called blocking. This is different from extinction, but it's very important. This occurs when a previous association prevents another association from being formed. So remember we talked about those old habits die hard, right? Well, those previous associations are going to be so prevalent that they are going to overpower any new association we try to make. So with phase one, if we see there with the bell kind of leading to the food, right? So that we ring the bell and we give the dogs food. I don't know why they picked cheese, but there you go, cheese. Bell and giving the dog food. If we tried to do another conditioned stimulus, adding a light with the bell and presenting food, it's not going to create another conditioned stimulus. the dog would kind of be like, okay. There would be no recognition of that stimulus as a new conditioned stimulus because that first one of the bell was so prevalent and so powerful. Now let's use another example of blocking just to kind of drive this point home. So let's say that a manager, Steve's a real jerk. He's the guy you don't want to see walk into the room because every time he walks into the room, he's going to fire someone or give us a bad announcement or something horrible, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is a pay cut announcement. In this example, let's say, let me set this up differently. Jim is a new manager. Jim is working alongside Steve. Steve tells Jim that they must make a pay cut announcement. And obviously this is going to lead to the other workers being mad because they know that just the sight of Steve, that something bad is going to happen. Something is going to happen. They just can't stand Steve because they know he always has bad news. So what could Jim do? Steve tells Jim, you know what, Jim? You should make the announcement so they don't think that I'm the bad guy. And Jim goes, well, I don't want to be the bad guy. So what could Jim do? Well, with blocking, here's how this would work. So let me set it up again. For our unconditioned stimulus is the pay cut announcement. No one wants to hear that, right? That pay cut announcement is going to lead to an unconditioned response of people being very displeased. Okay, so we have our unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Well, Steve is our conditioned stimulus. He has already been associated with all of these horrible work announcements. So he's our conditioned stimulus. So people just get mad when they see Steve. They're just like, there he is. That guy always tells us something bad. Well, what Jim could do is utilize blocking in the sense that he could deliver the announcement with Steve standing next to him. In this way, people will still associate that horrible announcement with Steve. They're not going to take it out on the new guy, Jim. They're going to stay with that original association, that original conditioned stimulus. So Steve is still going to be the bearer of bad news, even if he's not the one making the announcement. I hope that makes sense for blocking. If you need further examples, let me know. I'd be honored to help you out. And now let's get into the summary of classical conditioning. 4 things that are important to know about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning generates multiple responses. Different stimuli are going to generate different responses in different people. It's not always going to be the same. So maybe there's a classical conditioning of here. People are going to perceive events differently. If there is a smell in the room, and you and I are both sitting in the room, maybe it's the smell of cat pee. I don't know. And y'all hate cat pee. You just can't stand it because you think of your grandma who has 20 cats and how dirty her house was, right? Well, maybe I'm some kind of weirdo who likes the smell. I don't know. But we're going to perceive that stimuli differently, so we're going to have different responses. That's basically what we're saying. Those differences in perceptions are going to lead to different responses. Classical conditioning can be used to establish preferences and aversions. So you can learn to associate good things you like and also bad things, like nausea with certain foods, or good things like a certain cologne with the love of your life, okay? Classical conditioning underlies various psychological conditions. So, for example, classical conditioning is one of the methods that can ingrain some depressive habits, some depressive feelings, as well as anxiety. So people learn to associate different anxiety-provoking states with different stimuli, and it can kind of branch out to kind of deepen the severity of the psychological illness. And pairing the unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus is not sufficient for conditioning to occur. So basically what that means is you can't, I think they're getting at you can't do it You can do it once, but generally you have to pair these things repeatedly. And it's a very specific process you have to follow. So it's not like you can do this one time and you can expect it to form this association, unless it is very, very severe. So this could be like severe pain that someone learns to associate. But typically you need to gauge that person's reaction to the stimuli and adjust the process accordingly. So next we're going to talk about operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is learning through associations. Operant conditioning is learning through consequences. So for this activity, I was going to do this in class, but you could probably do this at home if you have someone at your disposal willing to help you. But you're going to be the trainer at home. And take like 3 objects. It could be like a balloon, maybe a piece of jewelry, or some kind of hat, right? And you're going to put these things out for your person and decide what you want them to do with an object. So let's say I have a balloon, a hat, and a pen out. Let's say I decide in my head I want my participant to blow up the balloon and tie it up, tie it off. I have to figure out how I'm going to do that by reinforcing them or punishing them accordingly, but you can't talk. So see if you could get this person to execute a task without talking to them. Think about what methods you're going to use. Are you going to nod your head yes to encourage them? Are you going to clap your hands, cheer for them every time they get close to it? Think about how you would accomplish this task. And then we're going to go a bit more into operant conditioning. So take the time to do that. If you need more instructions, I can provide them in the course shell. But here's a video of operant conditioning in action. So this is polar bear training at the St. Louis Zoo. So in a lot of zoos, they execute animal training using operant conditioning principles because they're trying to take the stress out of doing medical procedures with the animals. So they teach them to do things like touching a certain point. So as you can see in this video, and they have the polar bear touch its nose to the point. They have that animal learn that touching the point is a good thing. Then they can kind of direct the animal with that point to do things like standing up or opening its mouth. So check out this video because the operant principles are in a lot of these animal training videos that you'll come across, and it's very interesting to see how complicated it can be. It's such an seemingly easy topic to grasp sometimes, but seeing how it can be expanded and applied to non-human animals is really interesting. So take the time to watch this video.